You're not on this list." The words landed like a final decision no one was supposed to question, spoken with the kind of certainty that made people doubt themselves before they doubted authority. At Gate 14 of a major Chicago International Airport, the morning rush moved like clockwork, rolling suitcases, boarding calls, and the soft tension of people counting down to departure. But for Ava Richardson, everything stopped in that one sentence. She stood just a few feet from the scanning podium, holding a simple leather carry-on, dressed in a clean navy blazer, black slacks, and flat shoes that gave no hint of the billions attached to her name. To anyone watching, she looked like any other executive traveler, efficient, unremarkable, blending into the controlled chaos of business class boarding. Jason Miller, the gate's supervisor, didn't look up from his tablet when he repeated himself, slower this time, as if clarity would soften the refusal. "Your name is not showing in this group. You need to step aside." Behind him, Clara Bennett exchanged a quick glance with another staff member, her expression already shaped into assumption, the kind that formed before facts ever entered the room. Ava didn't react immediately. She simply looked at the screen, then at her boarding pass, then back at the system display without urgency or frustration, as if she had seen this kind of error before and already knew how it would unfold. Around them, passengers slowed their movements, sensing something unusual in the rhythm of the gate. A few phones lifted casually, not yet recording, just observing. Daniel Kim, seated at the secondary console, frowned slightly as he checked the internal system again. A soft flicker on his screen confirmed something Jason had not acknowledged. A VIP override tag attached to Ava Richardson's identity, greenlit and active. He hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard, but did not speak. Jason finally looked up, noticing Ava still standing there, not complying, not escalating, just present. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to follow instructions," he added, his tone tightening with controlled impatience. Clara stepped closer now, her voice carrying a sharper edge. "We're holding boarding. If there's an issue, you can take it up with customer service after." Ava tilted her head slightly, not in defiance, but in quiet confirmation of what she was already calculating internally. The system was wrong, or someone had made it wrong on purpose. Either way, she didn't raise her voice, didn't gesture, didn't demand attention. Instead, she simply placed her boarding pass back into her folder and looked past the staff toward the gate terminal itself, as if measuring something larger than the moment in front of her. The air around the counter felt different now, heavier, as passengers behind her began to slow completely, sensing that whatever came next was no longer about a simple boarding error. It was about control and who believed they held it. The tension at Gate 14 did not ease. It thickened, like air before a storm that everyone can feel but no one can name. Ava Richardson remained exactly where she stood, her posture unchanged, her presence calm in a way that made the surrounding noise feel unbalanced. Jason Miller finally set his tablet down with a sharper motion than necessary, as if forcing control back into the situation through physical certainty. "I am telling you again," he said, his voice now louder, attracting attention from nearby passengers. "Your boarding group is not active in this system. You are holding up the line." Clara Bennett stepped closer to the scanner, glancing at Ava's boarding pass again, then at the screen, then deliberately away from it, as if refusing to acknowledge the contradiction forming in front of her. "There must be an error in your reservation," she added, though her tone suggested it was not a question but a conclusion already made. Behind the counter, Daniel Kim shifted in his seat, his eyes flicking between the live system display and Jason's firm posture. The VIP override indicator was still there, steady and green, a quiet signal that did not match anything happening in front of him. His fingers tightened around the edge of the console, but he said nothing, hesitation building in the space between knowledge and action. Ava finally moved, not toward confrontation, but slightly to the side, aligning herself so she could see both the staff and the boarding screen at once. Her voice, when it came, was even and controlled. "Check the system again," she said, not as a request, but as a confirmation that something had already been missed. Jason let out a short breath, almost a laugh without humor. "We have already checked it. Multiple times. If your name is not here, then you are not cleared for boarding." A few passengers behind Ava shifted uncomfortably, one man lowering his phone after briefly lifting it, unsure whether this was a misunderstanding or something more deliberate. Clara glanced at him sharply, as if reinforcing an invisible boundary. Daniel's screen refreshed automatically in that moment, and the VIP tag flickered slightly, confirming authorization at a level that bypassed normal gate protocol. His expression changed, subtle but immediate, as recognition replaced doubt. He leaned forward slightly, about to speak, but Jason's voice cut across the space first. "Ma'am, last instruction. Step aside, or we will have to escalate this." Ava did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked down at her boarding pass one more time, then back at the gate scanner, her expression unchanged but now carrying something quieter and more precise, like a decision forming without announcement. The surrounding noise of the airport faded slightly in perception, not because it had stopped, but because attention had narrowed. This was no longer about a boarding mistake. It was about who would be allowed to define reality in the next few seconds, and who would be forced to accept it. The moment Ava Richardson asked for the system to be checked again, something subtle shifted in the atmosphere around Gate 14, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, like a mechanism beginning to respond to a hidden signal. Jason Miller did not like that shift. He stepped closer to the scanner, as if physical proximity could restore authority over digital truth, and typed in her last name again with more force than necessary. "There is nothing to check," he said, but his voice no longer carried the same certainty it had just moments before. Clara Bennett leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the screen quickly, then narrowing slightly as she saw the same indicator Daniel Kim had already noticed. The VIP override remained active, clear, and unmistakable, but neither Jason nor Clara acknowledged it directly. Instead, Clara spoke faster, lowering her tone but increasing pressure. "Sometimes corporate flags appear incorrectly. We should proceed with boarding and resolve discrepancies later." Ava stood still, listening without interruption, her expression unchanged, but her attention now fully aligned with the system display behind the counter. Daniel Kim finally shifted forward in his chair, his hand hovering just above the keyboard, and for a brief moment it looked like he might speak, but hesitation returned, pulling him back into silence. The gate announcement system echoed softly in the background, calling for priority boarding in another section, a reminder that time was moving even if this moment was not. Jason turned back toward Ava, his patience visibly thinning. "Ma'am, I am going to need you to comply with instructions now. We cannot hold this gate any longer." A few passengers behind her began to murmur, the energy changing from curiosity to discomfort, as if they were witnessing a disagreement that might soon affect their own schedules. One woman lowered her phone completely, stepping slightly back, while another man raised his again, unsure whether to record or disengage. Ava finally exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in recognition. She took a small step forward, closing the distance to the counter just enough that her voice would not need to rise. "You are looking at the wrong layer of authorization," she said calmly. Jason gave a short, dismissive nod. "We are looking at the only layer that matters for boarding." Daniel's screen refreshed again, and this time the VIP status expanded, revealing a secondary clearance line tied directly to terminal control access. His eyes widened slightly, and his breathing changed, but still he did not interrupt. Clara noticed his reaction and immediately straightened. "Daniel, what are you seeing?" she asked quickly. He hesitated, then responded carefully. "There is an executive-level override attached to this passenger." Jason turned sharply. "That is impossible," he said immediately, louder now, as if volume could invalidate data. Ava's gaze remained steady on the terminal display. For the first time, she was not observing the staff, but observing the system itself responding in real time. The environment around Gate 14 seemed to tighten further, passengers now fully aware that something beyond a simple boarding delay was unfolding. Jason reached for the scanner again, preparing to force a manual override, while Clara instinctively stepped closer to the control panel, as if preparing to contain a situation she no longer fully understood. Ava did not move, did not argue, did not escalate. She simply placed her boarding pass on the counter and waited, as if allowing the system to finish speaking before anyone else tried to interpret it. The atmosphere at Gate 14 shifted again, but this time it was no longer subtle. It was visible in the way people stopped pretending to be indifferent, in the way heads turned slightly more toward the counter, in the way silence began to replace casual airport noise. Daniel Kim's fingers moved carefully over the keyboard, and the expanded authorization panel now filled his screen in a way that left no room for ambiguity. The name Ava Richardson was not only validated, it was connected to a higher tier of access tied to terminal administration privileges. He stared at it for a long second before speaking, his voice lower than before. Jason, this is not a standard passenger profile. Jason Miller did not respond immediately. His attention was fixed on the scanner, as if repeating the same action might produce a different outcome. Clara Bennett, however, stepped closer to the screen and read the lines herself, her expression tightening as she processed what was in front of her. This could still be a system synchronization issue, she said quickly, but the confidence in her voice had started to fracture. Ava remained still, her hands resting lightly on her carry-on handle, her posture unchanged, as if she had already accepted that truth would surface without assistance. A few feet behind her, passengers were now fully engaged, no longer casual observers. One man leaned toward another and whispered something, while a woman raised her phone higher, clearly beginning to record. Jason finally turned back toward Ava, his tone sharper, but less stable. Even if there is an override flag, it does not change boarding procedures at the gate level. Daniel hesitated again, then spoke carefully. It actually does change gate level permissions if it is tied to terminal authority. That sentence created a silence that felt heavier than the earlier confusion. Clara immediately responded, Daniel, are you certain about that? He nodded once, reluctantly. Jason exhaled through his nose, frustration mixing with disbelief. So what are you suggesting? That she controls the terminal? Ava finally shifted her gaze directly to Jason. It was not a confrontational look, but it carried a clarity that made avoidance impossible. I am suggesting, she said calmly, that you are trying to override a system that is already above your clearance level. The words did not rise in volume, but they changed the temperature of the entire gate area. A passenger behind her stopped moving entirely. Another slowly lowered their suitcase handle. Clara looked down at the terminal again, and this time she did not try to reinterpret what she saw. Daniel leaned back slightly, as if distance could help him process the implications. Jason, however, remained fixed in place, his authority now colliding directly with data he could not dismiss cleanly. We need confirmation from Central Operations, he said quickly, almost reflexively. Ava gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. You may request it, she replied, but you will receive the same confirmation that is already on your screen. For the first time, Jason did not immediately respond. The scanner at the gate blinked softly, waiting for input that no longer felt straightforward. Clara's hand hovered near the communication panel, but she did not press anything. Daniel looked between Ava and the system again, and the realization in his expression became harder to hide. Whatever assumption had governed the last several minutes was no longer stable. Around them, Gate 14 had transformed from a routine boarding point into a silent space of recalibration, where every person present understood that the next decision would no longer be about procedure, but about recognition of authority that had already been established before anyone in uniform had spoken. The confirmation request to Central Operations had already changed the rhythm of Gate 14, but what followed was something even more unsettling than delay or confusion. It was hesitation spreading through trained authority. Jason Miller stood rigidly near the scanner, his hand still hovering, as if waiting for a version of reality that would restore his confidence. Clara Bennett had moved closer to the communication panel, but she had not initiated the call she earlier demanded, her eyes now scanning the same authorization lines repeatedly, as if repetition might produce a different interpretation. Daniel Kim, however, no longer looked uncertain. His focus had sharpened into clarity, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a careful but undeniable weight. Central Operations is already syncing with this terminal, he said, pausing briefly as new data refreshed on his screen, and they are confirming executive-level control linked to this passenger. The word executive was no longer abstract. It had become structural, embedded in the system itself. Jason finally turned toward Daniel, his expression tightening. Executive control of what exactly? He asked, though the question now sounded less like authority and more like resistance. Daniel hesitated only a moment before answering. Terminal access, gate override, and administrative permissions tied to airline operations infrastructure. A subtle shift passed through the surrounding space as those words reached not only staff, but nearby passengers who had begun to fully absorb the imbalance unfolding in front of them. Clara stepped back half a pace, her professional posture still intact, but no longer fully anchored. That level of access requires corporate authorization at the highest tier, she said, but this time her voice lacked its earlier certainty. Ava Richardson remained composed, her attention steady on the gate system, as if she were simply observing a process she had already initiated long before anyone began questioning her presence. Jason exhaled slowly, attempting to reclaim control through procedure. Even if what you are saying is accurate, he said, addressing Daniel but clearly directing the weight of his words toward Ava, we still have active boarding protocols. We cannot halt an entire gate operation based on a system anomaly. Daniel shook his head slightly. It is not an anomaly, he replied. It is authenticated. The silence that followed was no longer passive. It was investigative, as passengers who had been watching casually now fully faced the counter, sensing that the structure of authority in front of them was no longer stable. Clara looked toward Ava for the first time without immediate judgment, her expression now replaced with something closer to uncertainty. Jason, however, took a step closer to the scanner, as if proximity could force the system back into alignment with his expectations. Central Operations will clarify this, he said firmly, though the statement now felt like a delay rather than a resolution. Ava finally moved her gaze from the screen to Jason. Her expression had not changed, but the stillness around her seemed more defined, as if everything unnecessary had already been filtered out. They will not be clarifying anything, she said calmly. They will only be confirming what is already active. That sentence settled over the counter area like a final recalibration of control. Daniel leaned back slightly, no longer attempting to mediate between interpretations. Clara lowered her hand from the communication panel entirely. Jason remained facing the scanner, but for the first time, he did not attempt another input. Around them, Gate 14 had fully transitioned from a boarding point into a space of recognition, where authority was no longer asserted through uniform or position, but verified through systems that no one at the counter could override anymore. And every person present understood, without needing it spoken aloud again, that the decision about who controlled this space had already been made before the confrontation had even begun. The transition inside Gate 14 was no longer gradual. It had reached a point where silence itself felt like an announcement of change. Jason Miller stepped away from the scanner for the first time, not because the situation was resolved, but because it had moved beyond his ability to control it through repetition. Clara Bennett stood frozen near the communication panel, her eyes no longer scanning for errors, but for confirmation that her interpretation of procedure still applied. Daniel Kim, however, was the only one fully engaged with the system feed, and what he saw now removed the last layer of uncertainty from his expression. Central Operations has completed verification, he said slowly, as if allowing each word to settle before continuing. And they are confirming that terminal authority has been active under Ava Richardson's credentials since initial boarding sequence validation. Jason turned his head sharply. That is not possible, he replied immediately, but his tone no longer carried procedural confidence. Daniel did not respond with opinion. He simply rotated the screen slightly so both Jason and Clara could see the authorization chain clearly displayed, extending beyond gate control, beyond boarding protocol, and into full administrative command over terminal infrastructure. Clara took a step back, her hand lowering completely from the console, as if distance from the system might restore emotional balance. Jason stared at the screen, his jaw tightening, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed should exist. Around them, passengers had stopped pretending not to watch. The subtle movement of luggage and phones had disappeared, replaced by stillness and focus. Ava Richardson remained in the same position, her presence unchanged, but now it no longer felt passive. It felt established. Jason finally spoke again, but his voice had lost its earlier firmness. If this is real authorization, he said carefully, why was it not communicated before now? Daniel answered without hesitation. It was communicated. It was embedded in the system handshake at check-in. Standard gate-level interfaces did not prioritize display. That explanation did not restore control. It only clarified that control had existed elsewhere all along. Clara looked toward Ava, her expression no longer accusatory, but uncertain in a way that suggested recognition of error without knowing how to correct it. Jason took a slow breath, glancing once at the boarding line behind Ava, then back at the scanner, as if searching for a version of protocol that would allow him to continue his role. Ava finally broke her silence, her voice even and measured. "You were never supposed to see it as a question," she said. "Only as confirmation." That sentence shifted the space again. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Daniel lowered his gaze slightly, acknowledging the implication without resistance. Clara stepped fully away from the panel now, her posture softening into something closer to acceptance. Jason remained standing near the scanner, but his authority no longer had a functional target. The system was no longer something he could interpret or override. It had already decided. And in that realization, Gate 14 was no longer a checkpoint of access, but a space where hierarchy had quietly been rewritten in real time without permission from anyone still trying to enforce it. The silence at Gate 14 had reached a depth where even the smallest sound felt intentional, like footsteps carrying meaning rather than noise. Jason Miller stood near the scanner without moving, his eyes fixed on the system display that no longer responded to his authority, while Clara Bennett remained slightly turned away, as if looking at the counter from a different emotional distance could soften what the data had already confirmed. Daniel Kim was the only one still fully anchored to the terminal feed, and when the final authorization layer expanded across his screen, his expression changed in a way that made it clear he was no longer interpreting information, but absorbing consequence. "The system confirmation is complete," he said quietly, "and all executive and ownership level permissions are active under Ava Richardson's profile." Jason did not respond. Immediately, his attention shifted slowly from the scanner to Daniel, then back to Ava, as if searching for a missing piece that would restore the version of events he had been operating under. Ava remained still, her posture unchanged, but now there was a subtle finality in the way she observed the space, as if waiting for the moment when recognition would replace assumption. Clara finally spoke, her voice no longer sharp, but uncertain. "Ownership level," she repeated, as though saying it aloud might expose an error. Daniel nodded once. "Airline terminal infrastructure, operational control rights, and majority stakeholder authority are all linked to her identity." That sentence did not escalate the situation. It ended a previous version of it. Jason's breathing slowed, and for the first time he stepped back from the scanner entirely. The distance he created was not procedural. It was instinctive. Ava finally took a small step forward, closing the space between herself and the counter just enough that her voice would carry without effort. She did not raise it. She did not need to. "You have been interacting with a restricted layer of the system," she said calmly, "but not with the structure that governs it." Jason's mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as if every response he had prepared no longer matched the environment he was standing in. Clara looked at Ava directly now, her expression shifting into recognition that arrived too late to prevent misunderstanding. Daniel lowered his gaze toward the terminal, where the final line of authentication now displayed continuous active control, not temporary access, not delegated permission, but sustained authority. Ava continued, her tone unchanged. "This gate, this terminal, and every decision routed through this interface has been operating under frameworks I established before today's boarding sequence began." The words settled across the counter area with a weight that did not require repetition. Jason finally stepped back another half pace, his earlier insistence on protocol now replaced by a realization that protocol itself had been built on assumptions he never questioned. Clara turned slightly toward the passengers, then back again, as if unsure where authority now resided in physical space. Daniel remained still, no longer intervening, no longer interpreting, only confirming what the system had already made irreversible. Ava looked across all three of them, then added with quiet clarity, "You did not deny a passenger today. You attempted to deny access to a system that was never yours to control." In that moment, the structure of Gate 14 did not collapse outwardly. It simply stopped supporting the version of reality that had been enforced only minutes before, leaving behind a stillness where recognition replaced resistance, and authority was no longer something that could be claimed, only acknowledged. The shift that followed did not arrive as noise or disruption, but as a structured reversal of everything that had been assumed to be stable at Gate 14. Jason Miller remained standing near the scanner, but his stance had changed completely, no longer defensive, no longer authoritative, but uncertain in a way that made every movement feel secondary to the system that now operated beyond him. Clara Bennett had stepped away fully from the counter, her hands lowered, her eyes no longer focused on procedure, but on recognition of outcome she could not redirect. Daniel Kim stayed seated, but his attention was locked on the terminal feed, where control indicators now showed continuous authority transfer confirmation under Ava Richardson's credentials. System control transfer is now fully executed, he said softly, almost as if reading something that no longer required interpretation. All gate-level permissions, boarding control, and terminal operations are now under a single authorized profile. Jason turned his head slightly, but did not speak. The scanner in front of him remained active, yet functionally irrelevant. Ava stood where she had been since the beginning of the escalation, her presence unchanged, but now it was the space around her that had recalibrated. The tension that once belonged to confrontation had dissolved into structured compliance, not because it was forced, but because the system itself had finalized alignment. Clara finally spoke, her voice lower than before, no longer carrying resistance. "We were operating under incomplete access visibility," she said, as if trying to reconcile policy language with what had just occurred. Daniel did not respond to her interpretation. He simply continued observing the live feed as secondary permissions across the terminal began deactivating at local staff level. Jason stepped back another pace, now fully removed from the scanner zone, his earlier certainty replaced by a silence that had no procedural outlet. Ava's gaze moved across all three of them, not with confrontation, but with final observation. "There is no further action required from your side," she said calmly. "The system has already resolved the hierarchy." Around them, passengers no longer whispered or recorded. They were watching without interruption, not waiting for escalation, but for confirmation that what they were witnessing had fully concluded. Clara slowly nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of limitation. Daniel closed his terminal screen without being instructed to do so, as if the remaining data no longer required active monitoring. Jason finally lowered his hands completely, stepping away from the counter entirely, no longer positioned as gate authority, but as someone witnessing the end of a process he could not influence. Ava remained still for a moment longer, then looked toward the boarding path that had once been restricted. The gate was now open, not through override, but through structural authorization that had already been validated across the system. She did not announce anything further. She simply moved forward at a measured pace, and as she passed the counter, the environment did not react. It adjusted. The final state at Gate 14 was not disruption or conflict, but confirmation that authority had already shifted before anyone realized it had begun. The final transition at Gate 14 did not announce itself with urgency or interruption. It unfolded as a quiet confirmation that everything which had been contested moments earlier was no longer in dispute. Ava Richardson walked forward through the boarding path at a steady pace, her carry-on, rolling softly against the polished floor, each step matching a rhythm that no longer needed validation from any external authority. Behind her, Jason Miller remained near the scanner, no longer attempting to intervene, his posture reduced to observation rather than enforcement. Clara Bennett stood slightly off to the side, watching without commentary, her earlier certainty replaced by a professional silence that acknowledged structural change without attempting to reverse it. Daniel Kim remained at the terminal for a few seconds longer, watching as the system interface stabilized into a unified control state, all permissions now centralized under a single verified profile that no longer required explanation to function. As Ava approached the boarding threshold, the scanner emitted a soft confirmation tone, not triggered by manual input, but by pre-authorized clearance that activated automatically as she entered range. A nearby passenger instinctively stepped aside, not out of instruction, but recognition that movement itself had already been decided by the system. Clara's eyes followed that moment carefully, noting how procedure had transformed into acknowledgement without resistance. Jason finally looked up as Ava passed the final gate marker. There was no expression of confrontation left in him, only the awareness that what he had attempted to regulate had never been within his control layer to begin with. Ava paused briefly at the threshold, not to observe the staff, but to observe the space itself, the terminal, the structure, the flow of movement that had once been filtered through permission and denial. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and precise, directed not at individuals, but at the environment that had just recalibrated around her presence. This was never about access, she said quietly. It was about recognition. No one responded, not because they were instructed not to, but because there was nothing left to correct in that statement. The system behind the gate displayed full authorization continuity, confirming that all prior restrictions had been fully dissolved under executive-level governance. Daniel finally closed his session completely, stepping back from the terminal as if concluding a process that no longer required human oversight. Clara lowered her gaze briefly, then returned it forward, accepting the finality of what had occurred without attempting to reframe it. Jason remained still, his earlier authority now reduced to context rather than function. Ava continued forward into the boarding corridor, her presence no longer interacting with resistance, because resistance itself had no operational foundation left to engage. As she moved deeper into the aircraft access path, the environment behind her returned to standard flow, passengers proceeding, staff resuming motion, but the structure that had governed the interaction was no longer the same. It had been rewritten not through force, but through verification that arrived too late to be interpreted as conflict. And in that quiet resolution, Gate 14 became not a place of denial or confrontation, but a point of irreversible acknowledgement, where authority was not taken, not declared, but simply confirmed as already established long before anyone attempted to question it.